I knew something had broken the moment my daughter-in-law smiled and said I was taking too much space, and my own son smirked like it was a joke we all shared. In that instant, I understood I was no longer a mother in that house, just an inconvenience tolerated for comfort. Years of sacrifice collapsed into a single laugh. I did not cry. I did not argue. I smiled back, holding a truth they never saw coming. That night, I decided I would stop shrinking, and 10 days later, I left their lives for good, 3,000 kilometers away. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with resilience, hard truths, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink. This is a story you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Helen Whitmore. I am 62 years old, and for most of my life, I believe that if you loved hard enough, gave enough, and stayed quiet enough, you would always have a place to belong. I was wrong, but it took me a long time to understand that. I live in Columbus, Ohio, or at least I did then. Nearly 10 years had passed since my husband died of a sudden stroke, the kind that gives you no warning and no chance to say the things you assumed you still had time for. After the funeral, after the casseroles stopped coming, after the sympathy cards were tucked into a drawer, I learned how to live alone, not dramatically, not tragically, just quietly. I worked, I paid my bills, I kept the small house we had built together running as if he might walk back in one day and notice if something was out of place. That house was the biggest thing I owned. It was modest, tucked into a calm suburb, filled with memories that creaked as loudly as the floorboards. When my son Daniel got married, he and his wife talked about buying their first home. They were short on money, and I did not hesitate. I sold my house without bargaining, without regret, telling myself that bricks and walls mattered less than family. I handed over the money to Daniel because he was my son, and because trusting him felt as natural as breathing. They told me I would stay with them for a little while, just until things settled, just until I figured out my next step. I did not ask how long that would be. Mothers my age do not like to sound as if they are planning an exit from their children's lives. At first, it felt almost comforting. Their house was new, clean, full of light. Vanessa smiled politely. Daniel hugged me often, and I told myself this was what the next chapter looked like. That feeling did not last long. There was no room prepared for me, no bedroom with a door I could close. My bed was set up in a corner of the living room, separated by a thin wooden divider that let every sound through. The television, their late conversations, the clatter of dishes, all of it passed through that divider as if it were barely there. Days developed a rhythm that did not include me in any real way. I cooked because it made sense. I cleaned because I had always done so. I folded laundry because no one else seemed to notice it piling up. No one asked me to do these things, but no one stopped me either. Slowly, without a single conversation, it became expected. I was useful, and usefulness has a way of replacing gratitude when you are not paying attention. Daniel became busy. Vanessa became particular. I learned where I could sit without being in the way, which cabinets were no longer meant for my things, which parts of the house felt like borrowed space. I told myself this was temporary, that patience was a virtue, that sacrifice was a language I spoke fluently. Women of my generation are good at convincing themselves that endurance is love. At night, lying in that narrow bed, I stared at the ceiling and reminded myself why I was there. I was helping my son. I was doing what mothers do. I did not yet have the words for the unease settling into my chest, but I felt it all the same. Somewhere between the thin divider and the quiet hum of their lives continuing without me, I began to sense that I was no longer a person in that house. I was something else entirely. If you're still watching and starting to sense how quietly this pain began, comment number 1 below to let me know you're here. Because what happened next was not loud, but it changed everything. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The change did not arrive with shouting or slammed doors. It crept in quietly, disguised as organization, improvement, and good intentions. That was the most confusing part. If someone had been openly cruel, I might have known how to respond. Instead, everything came wrapped in politeness. Vanessa liked things clean, not just tidy but curated. Every surface had to look intentional, every object justified. She spoke often about minimalism, about how space affected mood, about how clutter created stress. At first, I admired her discipline. I had grown up believing that adapting was a form of kindness, so I adjusted myself without thinking. The first things to disappear were small. My handbag no longer sat on the side table where I left it. My coat was moved from the hallway hook to a closet I rarely used. Vanessa never asked. She simply informed me afterward, as if these changes were obvious and necessary. I told myself I was being sensitive. After all, it was not my house. Then came the chair. It was an old armchair I favored because it faced the window and caught the afternoon light. One evening I came home from errands and found the space empty. The chair had been moved to the garage. Vanessa explained that it made the living room feel crowded, that the room needed to breathe. Her tone was calm, almost apologetic. I nodded, even smiled, because arguing would have felt unreasonable. Daniel was always nearby during these moments. He heard the explanations, saw the adjustments, and said nothing. When our eyes met, he looked away or pretended to be distracted by his phone. I told myself he was tired from work, that marriage required compromises, that I should not put him in the middle. Mothers learn early how to step aside. Gradually, I began to monitor myself. I learned how much space my body took up when I moved through the kitchen. I waited before speaking, gauging whether my voice would interrupt the flow of their conversations. I folded my clothes smaller, stacked my belongings tighter, reduced myself inch by inch without being asked. It felt instinctive, like an old survival skill resurfacing. One evening, while we were all in the kitchen, Vanessa spoke about boundaries. She talked about how important it was for couples to establish their own rhythm, especially when older relatives were involved. Her words were measured, thoughtful, almost rehearsed. Then she looked at me and said she thought it might help if I learned to scale back a little. She framed it as concern, as advice offered for everyone's comfort. Daniel nodded. He did not look at me when he did it. That small gesture hurt more than any harsh sentence could have. In that nod was agreement, acceptance, and distance. I felt something shift inside me, a subtle but unmistakable understanding that I was no longer speaking from a place of authority or even familiarity. I was an influence to be managed. That night, lying in my narrow bed behind the wooden divider, I replayed every interaction in my mind. I wondered if I truly was too much, too present, too visible. I began cataloging my movements, my habits, my needs, as if I were a problem to be solved. Part of me felt wounded, another part defensive, both exhausted. Yet beneath the self-doubt, a quieter question formed, one I did not dare say aloud. It pressed against my thoughts as I listened to the muffled sounds of Daniel and Vanessa's life continuing on the other side of the divider. I asked myself whether this was what helping looked like, or whether I was slowly being erased for the sake of convenience. By the end of that week, I understood something important. No one had asked me to leave. No one had told me I did not belong. But every day, in careful and reasonable ways, I was being taught how little space I was allowed to take. If this chapter made you uncomfortable in a familiar way, comment number 2, so I know you're still with me, because the next moment exposed the truth in a way I could no longer ignore. Let's continue to chapter 3. The weekend Vanessa decided to host a barbecue felt different from the beginning. The house buzzed with preparation, not the quiet efficiency I was used to, but a nervous energy shaped by appearances. Vanessa moved quickly, checking lists, rearranging chairs, wiping already clean surfaces. Daniel followed her lead, attentive in a way I had not seen directed toward me in a long time. I was not asked to help. Instead, I was told, gently and with a practiced smile, that it would be easier for everyone if I stayed in my room while guests were there. The explanation came packaged as concern. People from work, casual conversation, nothing personal. I nodded because the alternative would have required me to explain why I deserved to be present in a house I did not own. From behind the thin divider, I listened as the yard filled with voices. Laughter spilled through the open windows, light and unrestrained. I could smell grilled food and hear music, the sound of a life unfolding without me. I told myself this was temporary, that it was just one afternoon. Still, the feeling of being tucked away like an inconvenience settled heavily in my chest. At some point, I needed water. It seemed like a small enough reason to step out. I moved quietly, careful not to draw attention, hoping no one would notice. The back door stood open, and the conversation drifted in easily. I paused when I heard someone remark that the house looked smaller than expected. The tone was casual, the kind of observation people make without thinking. Vanessa laughed. She said it was because I lived there. The response came immediately, a wave of laughter that rolled through the yard. It was not cruel in the way shouting is cruel. It was worse. It was effortless. My presence had been reduced to a punchline, a convenient explanation that cost nothing to offer. I stood still, unseen, holding a glass of water I no longer wanted. Then I heard Daniel laugh. It was brief, almost reflexive, but it cut deeper than the others. In that moment, I understood something with painful clarity. This was not a misunderstanding or a clumsy joke. This was how they saw me. I was not a mother who had given everything she had. I was an object that took up room, a burden made acceptable by humor. I did not confront anyone. I did not announce myself or demand an apology. I turned around and went back to my corner of the house. The divider offered no real privacy, but it gave me enough separation to breathe. Outside, the party continued. Inside, I sat on my bed and let the reality settle. There was no anger at first, only a strange numbness. I replayed the sound of Daniel's laugh in my head, over and over, until it lost its sharp edge and became something dull and heavy. I had spent years protecting him from disappointment, from difficulty, from consequences, and now, when I needed even the smallest gesture of protection, he had chosen comfort instead. As the afternoon stretched on, I stopped making excuses. I stopped telling myself that they meant no harm or that I was imagining things. The truth was simple and undeniable. I was not wanted in that space, except when I was useful. The laughter outside was proof enough. When the guests finally left and the house returned to its polished calm, no one came to check on me. No one asked how I felt. I lay awake that night listening to the familiar sounds of Daniel and Vanessa moving freely through the rooms, and for the first time, I allowed a new thought to take shape. If I stayed, this would only get worse, and if I wanted to survive with any sense of dignity left, I would have to be the one to leave. If you felt that silence hit harder than words, Comment number 3 below. What came next forced me to make a decision I had avoided for years. Now let's move on to chapter 4. After the barbecue, nothing was said. No one mentioned the joke, the laughter, or the way I had disappeared behind the divider for the rest of the afternoon. Daniel moved through the house as he always did, polite but distant. Vanessa returned to her routines, efficient and composed, as if nothing unusual had happened. Their silence confirmed what I already knew. From their perspective, nothing had gone wrong. I chose not to confront them, not because it did not hurt, but because I understood something essential. Speaking would not restore my dignity. It would only expose how much I still hoped to be seen. That hope had become dangerous. So I stayed quiet, but my silence was no longer passive. It was deliberate. I began by taking stock of what was still mine. Late at night, after the house had gone still, I pulled old folders from my suitcase and spread them across the narrow surface of my bed. Bank statements, retirement paperwork, documents I had not looked at in years. For a long time, I had treated these things as background noise, responsibilities I managed without thinking. Now, they felt like lifelines. That was when I remembered the investment my husband had made decades earlier. A small stake in a logistics company, something he had done almost casually, convinced it might help someday. After he died, I had left it untouched. I did not understand markets or growth, and I had never wanted to rely on money that felt theoretical. But desperation has a way of sharpening focus. I logged into the account for the first time in years and stared at the numbers until they began to make sense. They were larger than I expected, not enough to feel wealthy, but enough to feel possible. I started reading. Quietly, methodically, I educated myself the way I had learned to do everything else in life. I took notes in a small spiral notebook, careful to hide it beneath my clothes during the day. I researched housing markets, interest rates, distances. I was not chasing fantasy. I was building an exit that could hold my weight. California entered my thoughts slowly, not as an escape, but as a memory. I had once stood on the Pacific coast in my 20s, breathing in air that smelled like salt and promise. I had told myself then that life would eventually take me back. It never had. Now, the idea returned with a different meaning. Distance mattered. Space mattered. 3,000 kilometers felt like a boundary I could trust. By day, I played my role. I stayed unobtrusive, moved carefully, kept my belongings tucked away. I made myself smaller not because I believed I should, but because it gave me time. No one questioned me. No one noticed the shift inside me, the way my thoughts no longer revolved around their comfort. At night, I allowed myself to imagine what leaving would require. Not the logistics alone, but the emotional cost. I would be giving up proximity to my son, the illusion of family unity, the identity I had worn for decades. The fear was real, but it was clean. It did not gnaw at me the way staying did. For the first time, I stopped asking myself whether leaving would make me selfish. That question belonged to a version of me that believed endurance was proof of love. I was beginning to understand that survival required a different kind of courage, one that did not ask permission. I did not yet know how I would tell them. I did not know when. But I knew this much with certainty. I was no longer waiting to be pushed out. I was preparing to walk away on my own terms. If you're still watching and wondering what happens when preparation meets confrontation, comment number 4 to let me know. Because the next chapter is where everything finally explodes. Let's go to chapter 5. The night of Daniel's promotion dinner arrived with a strange sense of inevitability. I had known something would happen, though I did not know what shape it would take. The house was dressed up for the occasion, candles arranged with care, place settings aligned with intention. Vanessa moved through the room like a host who understood that appearances mattered more than comfort. Daniel wore his confidence like a new suit, still stiff, still unfamiliar. I took my place at the edge of the table. That was where I always ended up, close enough to be present, far enough to be ignored. Conversations flowed around me, filled with talk of work, bonuses, plans for the future. No one asked my opinion. No one needed it. I had learned how to sit inside that silence without drawing attention to myself. When dessert plates were cleared, Vanessa stood. She lifted her glass with the ease of someone accustomed to being heard. Her smile was practiced, her tone warm. She thanked everyone for coming, spoke about success, about milestones, about the importance of support. The room leaned toward her voice, ready to agree. Then she shifted. She talked about families and boundaries, about how everyone needed to understand their place. She praised those who knew when to help and when to step back. And then she said it, lightly, almost playfully, that some people simply took up too much space. Daniel smiled, not broadly, not cruelly, just enough. Something inside me went quiet. It was not shock. It was recognition. In that instant, every small dismissal, every careful erasure aligned into a single undeniable truth. I was not misunderstood. I was unwanted. And my own son had chosen to accept that narrative because it was easier than challenging it. I stood before I had time to second-guess myself. My chair scraped softly against the floor, a small sound that cut through the air. I lifted my glass. My hands were steady, which surprised me. When I spoke, my voice did not tremble. I said that I had just purchased a house on the Monterey coast in California. I said it calmly, without embellishment. I mentioned the ocean, the light, the quiet. I added that it was 3,000 kilometers away. The room froze. Conversation stopped mid-breath. Vanessa's smile faltered, caught between disbelief and calculation. Daniel stared at me as if he were seeing a stranger. No one laughed. I continued. I said that I would be leaving in 10 days, that I would no longer be around to inconvenience anyone, that they would have all the space they needed. I took a sip of wine, set my glass down, and thanked them for dinner. There was no anger in me, no desire to wound. I had already been wounded enough. What I felt instead was a startling clarity, like stepping out of a fog I had lived in for years. I did not wait for questions. I did not accept explanations. I walked to the door while the room remained suspended in silence. Behind me, I heard someone inhale sharply. Someone else shifted in their chair. No one followed. Outside, the air felt different, lighter. I stood for a moment on the porch, grounding myself in the quiet. Then I walked to my car and drove away without looking back. By the time I reached the end of the street, my hands began to shake, not from fear, but from release. The moment had passed. The words were said. There was no returning to the role I had played for so long. I had taken up too much space, they thought, so I claimed all of it. I drove through Columbus that night without a destination in mind. The streets were quiet, emptied of the noise that usually filled them after dinner. I did not turn on the radio. I did not call anyone. The silence felt earned, like a reward I had not known I was allowed to claim. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady now, the shaking gone. What remained was a calm so unfamiliar it felt almost unreal. By the time I returned to the house, the lights were still on. I did not go inside. I sat in the car for a long moment, breathing, listening to my own pulse slow. I understood something then with absolute clarity. If I walked back through that door, even just to sleep, the weight would begin to settle again. Questions would follow. Explanations would be expected. I would be pulled back into a role that no longer fit. So I stayed where I was, choosing distance over comfort for the first time. My phone vibrated. I did not look at it. I knew who it would be. I turned the screen face down and left it that way. This was not avoidance. It was restraint. I had spent decades answering immediately, fixing things quickly, smoothing over discomfort before it had time to exist. That reflex had kept me small. Tonight, I let the silence stand. I drove to a modest hotel on the edge of town and checked in with my name alone. The room was simple, clean, anonymous. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall, feeling the full weight of what I had done settle into my body. The pain was there, sharp and undeniable, but it was not chaotic. It was honest. I let it be. In the bathroom mirror, I barely recognized myself. Not because I looked different, but because I was standing without apology. No explanation formed on my lips. No justification waited behind my eyes. I saw a woman who had reached the end of endurance and chosen something else instead. That recognition steadied me more than reassurance ever had. The next morning, I made the decision official. I confirmed the movers. I booked my flight. I organized the paperwork that would transfer my life across 3,000 kilometers. Each step grounded the choice further into reality. This was not an emotional outburst. It was a plan, measured and deliberate, built on the same discipline I had used to survive for years. There were moments when the grief surged unexpectedly. A familiar intersection, a memory of Daniel as a child, small and trusting, his hand wrapped around my finger. I did not push those moments away. I let them pass through me. Loving my son had shaped my life. Leaving did not erase that love. It simply refused to let it destroy me. I understood that there would be consequences. Distance would change things. Absence would be interpreted as punishment, abandonment, selfishness. I accepted that. Freedom is rarely granted without cost. I was willing to pay it. That night, lying in a bed that belonged only to me, I felt something close to relief. Not happiness, not yet. Relief that I had stopped negotiating my worth. Relief that I no longer needed permission to exist fully. I was not leaving to make a point. I was leaving because staying had become a slow erasure, and I had finally chosen myself over the comfort of others. If you're still here after that turning point, comment number 6 below. Because walking away was only the beginning. The real consequences came next. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. The days after I left unfolded exactly as I expected, though the certainty still surprised me. My phone lit up at first with urgency. Missed calls stacked on one another. Messages arrived in uneven waves, swinging between confusion and irritation. I did not open them. I did not need to. Silence had become my boundary, and I guarded it carefully. As the week progressed, the urgency softened into something else. The messages grew shorter. The calls stopped coming at predictable hours. I could sense the shift without witnessing it. The house I had once helped hold together was learning how to function without the quiet labor it had taken for granted. What disappeared first were the invisible things. The rhythm, the ease. Meals no longer appeared without planning. Small tasks piled up because no one had assumed responsibility for them. I had been the connective tissue, unnoticed until the strain caused something to tear. Without me, the structure began to show its seams. Daniel had never understood how much of his daily comfort depended on what I provided without comment. Vanessa had believed efficiency was her strength, but efficiency requires systems, and I had been one of them. When I removed myself, they were left with expectations that no longer had a place to land. I imagined the arguments beginning quietly, not dramatic fights, but sharp exchanges over undone chores, forgotten details, miscommunications that escalated because there was no buffer left. Without someone absorbing the friction, it had nowhere to go but outward. While their world adjusted, mine opened. Monterey welcomed me with air that felt different in my lungs. The light was softer, the horizon wider. I moved into a temporary rental near the coast, modest but bright, with the windows that faced the water. At night, I slept without listening for footsteps or voices beyond a divider. I woke without calculating how much space my presence would occupy. The quiet was not empty. It was full in a way I had never experienced. I brewed coffee and drank it slowly, letting the morning arrive without interruption. I walked along the shoreline and felt my thoughts stretch out, no longer compressed by caution. For the first time in years, I was not bracing myself against someone else's expectations. Distance gave me clarity. I began to see how much I had carried and how little of it had ever been acknowledged. I had not failed them by leaving. I had simply stopped compensating for choices that were never mine to make. The messages from Daniel eventually changed in tone. Less accusation, more uncertainty. I could sense the absence of the certainty he once had about his life. I did not feel satisfaction in that, only confirmation. Growth often begins where comfort ends. I reminded myself daily that I was not responsible for managing the fallout. I had not caused the imbalance. I had merely stepped away from it. Their struggle to adapt was not a punishment I had designed. It was a consequence they had avoided until now. In the evenings, I sat by the window and watched the sky darken over the Pacific. The sound of waves grounded me in a way nothing else ever had. I was not hiding. I was not escaping. I was inhabiting my own life fully for the first time. I knew the consequences of my departure would continue to ripple outward. I also knew I would not return to soften their impact. My role as the silent stabilizer had ended. Whatever came next would have to be built without me holding everything in place. By the time the keys to my new house rested in my palm, I had stopped feeling like a guest in my own life. The house stood on a quiet street, not far from the coast of Monterey, solid and unpretentious, with wide windows that welcomed light instead of hiding from it. When I unlocked the door for the first time, there was no rush of celebration, no dramatic moment. What I felt was steadiness. This place was mine, not borrowed, not conditional, not dependent on how useful I could be to someone else. The first days passed slowly, and I let them. I unpacked one box at a time, placing things where they felt right instead of where they would bother no one. I slept deeply, without listening for movement in another room, without adjusting my breathing to avoid being heard. Mornings arrived gently. I drank coffee by the window and watched fog lift off the hills, realizing how long it had been since my thoughts were allowed to wander without interruption. Silence became my companion. At first, it felt unfamiliar, almost too loud in its emptiness. But gradually, I understood that what I was hearing was not absence. It was my own voice, finally unobstructed. I noticed how my body responded to the lack of tension. My shoulders lowered, my jaw unclenched. I stopped bracing myself for criticism that never came. I began to meet people, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. A neighbor introduced herself while I was struggling with a garden hose. We spoke briefly, kindly, without probing questions or assumptions. At a small local cafe, the barista remembered my order after the third visit. These interactions were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried a weight I had not felt before. No one expected anything from me beyond my presence. For the first time in years, I invested in myself without guilt. I scheduled doctor appointments I had postponed. I walked along the shoreline each afternoon, letting the rhythm of the waves regulate my thoughts. I bought fresh food and cooked only when I felt like it, discovering that nourishment tasted different when it was not tied to obligation. Slowly, my identity began to loosen from the one role it had been anchored to for so long. I was no longer introducing myself, even internally, as someone's mother first. I was a woman with a history, yes, but also with preferences, limits, and plans that belonged solely to me. That realization was both liberating and unsettling. Freedom requires responsibility, and I was learning how to carry it. News from Ohio reached me occasionally, filtered through messages I read only when I felt steady enough. Daniel was struggling. Work tensions, financial strain, friction at home. I felt concern, but it did not consume me. I reminded myself that empathy did not require intervention. Caring did not mean returning to a place that diminished me. I reflected often on how easily love becomes confused with sacrifice. I had believed for most of my life that enduring discomfort was proof of devotion. Distance taught me otherwise. Love could exist with boundaries. In fact, it often needed them to survive. As weeks passed, the house began to feel lived in. Not perfect, not staged, but honest. I filled the space with things I liked, not things that disappeared into corners. Each choice, no matter how small, reinforced a truth I was still learning to trust. I was allowed to take up space. By the end of that month, I was no longer searching for an escape or a solution. I had found something quieter and stronger. Stability. I stood firmly in a life I was actively shaping, aware that whatever came next would meet me on ground I had chosen for myself. If you've made it this far and feel the weight of what this journey cost and what it gave, comment number 8 to stay with me. The ending brings clarity no one expected. Let's move into the final chapters and see how it all ends. Time passed in a way it never had before. Not rushed, not heavy, but steady. By the time 3 full months had settled behind me in Monterey, my life no longer felt like a reaction to anything. It had its own rhythm. I had routines that belonged to me alone, mornings shaped by light instead of obligation, evenings defined by quiet choice. I no longer measured days by how useful I had been to someone else. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons that Daniel finally called. I almost did not answer, not out of fear, but because I had learned to pause before opening old doors. When I did pick up, I recognized his voice immediately, though it sounded different, lower, slower, stripped of the sharp edge of expectation that used to sit beneath every word. He did not ask how I was. He did not ask when I was coming back. He simply said my name. There was a long silence between us, not uncomfortable, just honest. When he spoke again, he told me things without dressing them up. He said the house had felt empty in ways he had never noticed before. He said he had not realized how much had been done quietly, without credit, without acknowledgement. He admitted that laughing that night, even briefly, was something he thought about more than he wanted to. I listened. I did not interrupt. I did not rush to reassure him or soften what he was saying. For the first time in our lives, I let him sit with his own words. He said he understood now that I had not overreacted, that I had not embarrassed anyone, that what I did had been the result of years of being diminished, not one sharp moment. He said it took losing my presence to understand what it had meant. I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief exactly, but completion. I had not left to hear these words, yet hearing them closed a circle I had been carrying for decades. When it was my turn to speak, I chose my words carefully. I told him that I loved him, that had never changed, but I also told him that my leaving was not temporary, that I would not return to live in a space where I had to earn my right to exist. I said that if we were to have a relationship going forward, it would need to be one built on respect, not access. He did not argue. He did not try to negotiate. That was how I knew the change was real. He said he understood, not as a concession, but as an acceptance. He said he was learning how to live without leaning on someone else to absorb the weight of his choices. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not ask for comfort. He simply said he was sorry and that he was trying to do better. When the call ended, I sat by the window for a long time. The ocean stretched out in front of me, vast and unmoved by human repair. I realized then that I no longer needed validation to feel secure in my decision, but receiving it, without strings attached, felt like a gentle acknowledgement of truth rather than a demand to return. Distance had done what proximity never could. It had stripped away habit, obligation, and entitlement, leaving only what was real. What remained between Daniel and me was not the relationship we once had. That one was gone, but in its place stood the possibility of something quieter, smaller, and more honest. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, I understood that resolution does not always arrive with reunion or apology. Sometimes it arrives when you finally stop shrinking yourself to fit a space that was never meant to hold you. I had left to survive. What I found instead was a life that could finally breathe. Mornings in Monterey arrive without urgency. Light slips through the windows before sound does, and the ocean breathes at a pace that refuses to be hurried. On one such morning, I stood barefoot on the wooden floor of my living room, coffee warming my hands, and realized that nothing in my day required me to shrink. No one needed managing. No approval waited to be earned. The quiet was not absence anymore. It was presence. I thought about the woman I had been before all of this began, the one who measured her worth by how little trouble she caused, the one who folded herself into corners, who learned to anticipate discomfort before it was spoken, who believed that love meant endurance. That woman had not been weak. She had been trained. She had learned to survive in spaces that only valued her usefulness. Leaving did not make me brave overnight. Courage came in increments. It came in unanswered calls. In the first night alone, in mornings where guilt arrived uninvited and left without being entertained. It came when I stopped explaining myself, when I accepted that being misunderstood was a smaller price than being erased. For a long time, I believed I had taken up too much space. The words settled into me because they echoed fears I already carried. But distance taught me something fundamental. Space is not something you steal from others. It is something you are allowed to occupy by existing. When people feel crowded by your presence, it is often because they benefited from your silence. Family, I learned, does not grant permission to diminish. Love does not require disappearance. And motherhood, while sacred, does not cancel the right to a life that feels whole. I did not stop loving my son when I left. I stopped abandoning myself. There is no bitterness in me now, no desire to punish or prove anything. I did not build this life to make anyone regret their choices. I built it because staying had begun to cost me pieces I could not afford to lose. Peace came not from winning, but from standing firmly in what I knew to be true. Sometimes I think of the room I once lived in, divided by thin wood, my world reduced to a fraction of what it could be. The contrast no longer hurts. It reminds me of how far I have come. I can hold compassion for that past without returning to it. If there is a message in all of this, it is not loud. It does not shout or demand attention. It simply says this: you are not too much. You were just in a place that required you to be less. I step outside now and let the air fill my lungs completely. The horizon stretches wide and unapologetic. I do the same. I did not take too much space. The world I lived in was too small, so I built my own. In the end, This story is not about distance, property, or loss. It is about reclaiming the right to exist fully. It is about learning that love without respect slowly turns into self-erasure, and that boundaries are not punishments, but acts of survival. Sometimes growth does not come from holding on tighter, but from letting go with clarity and courage. When we stop shrinking to fit spaces that deny us dignity, we discover how much strength we had all along. Life does not ask us to disappear for the comfort of others. It asks us to live honestly, even when that choice is misunderstood. True peace is not found in approval, but in alignment with oneself. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it resonated with you or reminded you of your own journey, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here. Do not forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more stories that speak to courage, healing, and self-worth.